Colonel Bantry was found dead at exactly 10:17 inside a locked library. The gun was beside his body. The window was wide open, and there was no way anyone could have entered. But Miss Marple noticed something no one else did, a tiny blue thread beneath the window. She looked at the clock, then at the suspects, and suddenly she knew the murderer had made one mistake. They had left behind the one clue that could expose everything. Chapter 1. The First Spark. The fog had settled over St. Mary Mead like a heavy gray curtain, swallowing the narrow lanes and softening the glow of every gas lamp. Rain tapped gently against the windows of the village cottages, while somewhere beyond the hedgerows, the wheels of a late carriage rattled over the wet road. At the edge of the village, Miss Jane Marple sat beside her fireplace, knitting calmly beneath the warm yellow light, apparently unaware that before the night was over, a murder would disturb the quiet life of St. Mary Mead. Nobody thought of Miss Marple as a detective. That was precisely why she was so good at watching people. She had no police authority, no impressive collection of scientific instruments, and no intimidating manner. She was simply an elderly lady with silver hair, a pleasant expression, and a remarkable knowledge of human nature. People spoke freely in front of her because they believed she was harmless. They complained about their neighbors, whispered about family quarrels, and revealed secrets they would never have confessed to an inspector. Miss Marple listened. She always listened. That evening, however, even she had not expected a knock at the door. It came shortly after 11, 3 sharp knocks. Miss Marple lowered her knitting. For a moment, there was only the sound of rain. Then came another knock. She rose slowly and crossed the room. When she opened the door, Inspector Slack stood outside beneath a black umbrella. His coat was wet, his hat was dripping, and his face carried the expression of a man who had already spent too many hours dealing with unpleasant facts. "Miss Marple," he said, "I'm afraid I have some bad news." She stepped aside. "Come in, Inspector. You must be freezing." Slack entered, removing his hat. "There has been a murder." Miss Marple's expression changed only slightly. "Where?" "Blackthorn Manor." She knew the house. Everyone in St. Mary Mead did. Blackthorn Manor belonged to Colonel Arthur Bantry, a retired military officer who had served abroad and returned to England with enough money to purchase the estate. He was respected, wealthy, and, according to village opinion, difficult. "Colonel Bantry?" she asked. Slack nodded. He was found dead in his library. The knitting needles remained still in Miss Marple's hands. How? A gunshot. And who discovered him? His wife. A silence followed. Miss Marple looked toward the fire. "Poor Mrs. Bantry. She is in a terrible state." "Of course." Slack hesitated. "There's something else." Miss Marple waited. "The circumstances are rather peculiar." That interested her. How peculiar? The library door was unlocked, but there was no sign of forced entry. The pistol was found beside the body. Colonel Bantry owned it legally, so at first glance it appears straightforward. "Straightforward," Miss Marple repeated. Slack gave a tired smile. "Yes, my dear Inspector, murders are very rarely straightforward." He sighed. "I knew you'd say that." Miss Marple returned to her chair. "Tell me everything." Slack opened his notebook. "Colonel Bantry was last seen alive shortly after 10. His wife says she went upstairs at approximately 10:15. At 10:45, she returned downstairs and found him in the library. Anyone else in the house?" "5 people, including the Colonel." "Who?" "Mrs. Bantry, their nephew Edward, the secretary Peter Hale, and the housekeeper Mrs. Gibbons." Miss Marple nodded. "And the 5th?" "The Colonel, naturally." She smiled faintly. "Quite," Slack continued. "Edward claims he was in the billiard room. Peter Hale says he was working upstairs. Mrs. Gibbons says she was in the kitchen. And Mrs. Bantry? Upstairs." Miss Marple looked into the fire. "Did anyone hear the shot?" "No." "Interesting." "Yes." "Was the window open?" Slack looked up. "Yes." Miss Marple's knitting needles stopped again. Open? Wide open? On a night like this? Slack glanced toward the rain-streaked window. Exactly. Miss Marple said nothing. The first small ember had appeared. It was not the pistol. It was the window. A murder committed on a cold, rainy night, yet someone had left a library window wide open. Why? Perhaps to suggest that the murderer had escaped that way. Perhaps to suggest that an outsider had entered. Or perhaps simply because the person responsible wanted everyone to look in the wrong direction. Miss Marple stood. I should like to see the house. Slack frowned. Tonight? If it isn't too inconvenient. It's nearly midnight. Yes, she smiled. And the murderer has already had several hours to become comfortable with their story. Blackthorn Manor stood beyond the village, surrounded by old trees and a stone wall. By the time Miss Marple arrived with Inspector Slack, the rain had become heavier. Their footsteps sounded sharply against the wet stone path as they approached the house. The front door opened before they reached it. Arthur Bantry stood there. He was a young man of perhaps 30, tall and broad-shouldered, with tired eyes. Inspector, Edward. His gaze moved toward Miss Marple. Who is she? Miss Marple. Something flickered across his face. Recognition. Fear. Miss Marple could not yet say. They entered the house. The smell of damp wool, coal smoke, and furniture polish filled the hallway. Gas lamps burned along the walls, their flames trembling whenever the wind pressed against the windows. The library was at the end of the corridor. Colonel Bantry lay beside his desk. Miss Marple did not approach the body immediately. Instead, she looked at the room, the carpet, the desk, the fireplace, the window, the chair. Then she looked at the floor. Inspector Slack watched her. Well? Miss Marple pointed. What's that? Beneath the library window was a small piece of blue wool. Slack crouched and examined it. A thread. Yes, probably from someone's clothing. Perhaps. He placed it carefully into an evidence envelope. Miss Marple walked closer to the window. The rain had blown against the sill. There was mud there. Not ordinary black garden soil, a reddish-brown clay. She touched nothing, but she noticed. Inspector? Yes. Where does that garden path lead? Slack looked outside. Toward the greenhouse. Miss Marple nodded. And who uses the greenhouse? Mrs. Bantry mostly. She turned back toward the room. The pistol lay beside the colonel's hand. The obvious clue, the obvious weapon, the obvious answer. But Miss Marple had never trusted obvious answers. She looked once more at the blue thread, then at the mud, then at the open window. 3 details, 3 small embers. Perhaps they meant nothing. Perhaps they meant everything. Miss Marple turned toward Inspector Slack. Tell me something. What? Why did the murderer open the window? Slack stared at her. We don't know that it was the murderer. Miss Marple smiled. No. She looked into the dark garden. But someone did. Outside, the gas lamps flickered in the rain. Somewhere beyond the trees, a clock began to strike midnight. Miss Marple returned to her knitting. She had not solved the murder, not yet. But she had seen the first spark. And once a careful observer notices an ember, it is very difficult to stop looking for the fire. The first embers glowed in the darkness. The fire of truth had begun. Chapter 2. Gathering Kindling. Morning came slowly to St. Mary Mead. The fog that had covered the village during the night had not disappeared entirely. It clung to the hedgerows and garden walls, turning the familiar lanes into pale ribbons beneath the weak November sunlight. At Blackthorn Manor, however, there was no peaceful morning routine. The servants moved quietly. Doors opened and closed with unusual care, and every conversation seemed to end the moment someone else entered the room. A murder had changed the house. Miss Jane Marple noticed such changes. People often imagined that grief made everyone behave differently. In truth, she had found, grief revealed what had already been hidden. At 8:30, she sat in the drawing room with Inspector Slack. drinking tea from a thin porcelain cup, while rainwater slid down the tall windows. 5 people, Slack said, opening his notebook. 5 possible stories. Miss Marple stirred her tea. And 5 reasons to lie. Slack looked at her. You think everyone is lying? My dear Inspector, everyone lies. Even about murder? Especially about murder. Slack sighed. He had spent years dealing with criminals, but Miss Marple's calm certainty still irritated him. The difficulty, he said, is separating ordinary lies from important ones. Miss Marple smiled. That is exactly why we must listen carefully. The first person brought into the room was Edward Bantry. He looked exhausted, his dark hair was untidy, and there were shadows beneath his eyes. He stood rather than sitting, as though he wanted the interview to end quickly. You were in the billiard room last night? Slack asked. Yes. From what time? About 10 until 11. Anyone see you? No, Slack frowned. So you have no alibi. Edward's jaw tightened. I didn't kill my uncle. Miss Marple watched him. You disliked him? Yes. Very much. Edward hesitated. Yes. Why? Because he treated everyone as though they were beneath him. Were you arguing with him yesterday? Yes. What about? Money. The room became quiet. Miss Marple placed her teacup down. How much money? Edward looked embarrassed. 1,000 pounds. Slack raised an eyebrow. Your uncle refused? He said I was irresponsible. And were you? Edward gave a bitter laugh. Perhaps. Miss Marple glanced down. His boots were covered with pale chalk dust. She looked toward Slack. Where did you say you were? The billiard room. Indeed. Edward noticed her examining his boots. What? Nothing. But it was something. The chalk confirmed his story. He had been in the billiard room recently. At least for part of the evening, a small ember, not enough to clear him, but enough to prevent an easy accusation. The next suspect was Peter Hale. The colonel's secretary entered with a folder beneath his arm. He was younger than Edward, perhaps 28, neatly dressed, with carefully combed brown hair. He seemed calm, too calm. Where were you? Upstairs. Doing what? Sorting the colonel's correspondence. For how long? Most of the evening. Miss Marple looked at his hands. Ink stains marked his right index finger and thumb. Did you write any letters? No. Then why the ink? Peter glanced down. I was handling documents. Of course. His answer was immediate. Too immediate. Miss Marple smiled politely. Did Colonel Bantry have enemies? Peter's expression changed. Yes. Who? I wouldn't know. But you were his secretary. I handled business correspondence, not personal affairs. Another ember. Miss Marple leaned back. What sort of letters did he receive? Ordinary letters. Any threatening ones? Peter froze. Only for a second. But Miss Marple saw it. Inspector Slack did not. I don't believe so, Peter said. Miss Marple said nothing. The careful listener might have noticed the inconsistency. Peter had first said he knew nothing of the colonel's personal affairs. Yet now he was certain there had been no threatening letters. How could he know? The question remained unanswered. Then came Sir Julian Carr. He arrived wearing a dark morning coat, carrying a silver-topped walking stick. He was an imposing man in his 60s, with a white mustache and the controlled manner of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Colonel Bantry and I disagreed, he said. About? Land. How serious was the disagreement? Very. Did you threaten him? Sir Julian's eyes narrowed. I told him that if he continued with his plans, I would take legal action. Not murder? Certainly not. Miss Marple smiled. I'm glad. Sir Julian looked at her. Why? Because legal action is usually much less troublesome. For the first time, he almost smiled. But when he shifted his walking stick, Miss Marple noticed something. The brass tip was perfectly clean. Outside, the garden was soaked from the previous night's rain. Anyone who had crossed the muddy path should have carried some trace of it. yet Sir Julian's stick showed none. Another ember. Later, Miss Marple visited the kitchen. Mrs. Gibbons was preparing breakfast for the household. The smell of toast, coffee, and coal smoke filled the warm room. Copper pans hung along the wall, and the old kitchen clock ticked loudly above the fireplace. "Mrs. Gibbons," Miss Marple said, "you told Inspector Slack that you heard the clock strike 10:30. Yes. Were you in the kitchen? Yes. All evening? Yes." Miss Marple smiled. "Then you couldn't have seen anyone enter the library?" "No." "Nor leave it?" "No." Mrs. Gibbons's hands tightened around the teapot. Miss Marple noticed. "Did you hear anything else?" "No." "Not even a door?" "No." "Footsteps?" "No." "Then you were fortunate." Mrs. Gibbons looked up. "Why?" "Because someone was moving through the house." The woman's face lost some color. Miss Marple did not press her. Not yet. She turned toward the kitchen window. Beyond it stood the greenhouse. Its glass panels were wet and gray beneath the morning sky. "Who uses the greenhouse?" "Mrs. Bantry." "Only her, mostly." Miss Marple nodded. She walked outside. The garden was cold and damp. Wet leaves clung to the stone path, and the smell of earth rose from the flower beds. She walked slowly toward the library window. The blue wool thread was still there. Police had marked the spot. Miss Marple crouched. Beneath the window was the reddish-brown clay she had noticed the night before. She examined it carefully. Then she looked toward the greenhouse. The soil around its entrance was darker, almost black, different from the clay beneath the library window. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Someone had stood beneath that window. But perhaps they had not come from the greenhouse. Perhaps they had come from somewhere else. She followed the path. At the greenhouse door, she found a tiny footprint pressed into the wet soil. A woman's shoe. Small, narrow. Miss Marple leaned closer. There was something caught in the mud beside it. A silver thread. She gently pointed it out to Inspector Slack. He frowned. "Another thread? This one is silk." Meaning that someone wearing an expensive garment was standing here. Slack looked toward the manor. "Mrs. Bantry? Perhaps." They returned inside. Mrs. Bantry was waiting in the drawing room. She was pale and visibly exhausted. Miss Marple sat opposite her. "Mrs. Bantry, I must ask you something." "Yes?" "Did you leave your bedroom last night?" The woman hesitated. "Yes." "When?" "After 10. "Why?" She looked toward the fireplace. "I wanted to speak to my husband." "About what?" "My marriage." Miss Marple waited. Mrs. Bantry's voice trembled. Arthur had become impossible. "Did you argue?" "Yes." "Did you threaten him?" "No." "Did he threaten you?" Mrs. Bantry looked up sharply. "No." Miss Marple studied her face. There was fear there, but not fear of the police. Fear of something else. "Did Colonel Bantry receive any unusual letters?" Mrs. Bantry's lips parted. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she whispered, "Yes." Inspector Slack immediately leaned forward. "What sort of letters?" "I don't know. How many?" "3. "Threatening?" Mrs. Bantry nodded. "Did you see them?" "Yes." "Where are they?" "I destroyed them." Slack stood. "Why?" Mrs. Bantry looked at him. "Because I was afraid." Miss Marple's eyes remained fixed on her. "Afraid of whom?" Mrs. Bantry didn't answer. Outside, a hansom cab passed along the distant road, its wheels splashing through the wet street. The sound faded into the fog. Miss Marple looked again toward the garden. Blue wool, silk, reddish clay, a false clock time, a secretary who knew too much, a nephew with a financial motive, a neighbor with a land dispute, and a wife who was hiding something. The murder was no longer a simple shooting. It was becoming a pattern, and patterns, Miss Marple knew, were made from small details. That evening, as she prepared to leave Blackthorn Manor, she paused beneath the library window. A gust of cold air moved through the garden. The gas lamps flickered. Miss Marple looked down. For just a moment, she noticed something beneath the rose bushes. A torn piece of paper. She picked it up. Only 3 words remained visible. "You will pay." Miss Marple folded the fragment carefully. Nobody else had noticed it. Nobody had even thought to look. She slipped it into her handbag. The kindling was gathered. The smoke was rising, and somewhere inside Blackthorn Manor, the murderer was beginning to realize that Miss Marple was not nearly as harmless as she appeared. Chapter 3: Deeper Waters. The telegram Holmes had ordered was answered before noon. A messenger arrived at Blackthorn Hall, carrying a sealed envelope from London. Holmes read it beside the library window, his face giving away nothing, while outside, the snow continued to fall in fine, restless flakes. "Well?" I asked. He folded the telegram. Sir Reginald Ashcombe had dealings with a man named Victor Karelin. The name meant nothing to me. Who is he? A Russian intermediary who has appeared in several police reports without ever appearing in a courtroom. Lestrade frowned. "You're suggesting this is some sort of international affair. I am suggesting that we should not decide what it is until we have examined the evidence." Holmes placed the telegram in his pocket. "Take me back to the boathouse." We crossed the frozen grounds once more. The snow had covered portions of the earlier tracks, but the deeper impressions remained visible. The wind carried the smell of the river, cold stone, wet rope, and distant coal smoke from the railway line beyond the village. Inside the boathouse, Holmes went directly to the body site. "Show me where Sir Reginald was found." Lestrade pointed. Holmes crouched and examined the floorboards. "Watson, look here." I bent down. A narrow scratch ran across the wood. "It appears to be a mark from furniture." "No." "Observe its direction." I followed the line with my eyes. "It leads toward the river, exactly." Holmes moved several feet farther. There, beneath the edge of a wooden bench, he found another mark. The chair was moved. Lestrade shook his head. "Doctor said it was knocked over during the struggle." "Perhaps." Holmes lifted the chair and examined its legs. There was a thin smear of white frost along one side. He smiled faintly. The chair was outside. "Outside?" I exclaimed. "Look at the frost, Watson. It formed after the wood had been exposed to freezing air. Someone brought this chair inside after leaving it outdoors." Lestrade stared at him. "Then why?" "That is precisely the question." Holmes began searching the room again. He found a length of rope, several empty wooden crates, and a small brass key beneath a coil of canvas. The key was blackened with oil. "What does it open?" I asked. Holmes turned it between his fingers. "Something frequently handled." Lestrade examined it. "Could belong to the house." "No." Holmes pointed to a tiny mark engraved near the bow. "A railway company." We exchanged glances. "Which company?" I asked. Holmes smiled. "That is what we shall discover." Our investigation took us to the small railway station several miles from Blackthorn Hall. The station master was a broad man with a red face and a thick woolen scarf wrapped around his neck. The waiting room smelled of coal, damp clothing, and stale bread, while the sharp whistle of a departing train echoed through the frozen air. Holmes showed him the key. "Have you seen this?" The station master examined it. "Yes, that's for the luggage warehouse." "Who has access?" "Staff, mostly." "Anyone else?" he thought. "There's a private key for one of the estate's servants." "Which servant?" "Thomas Bell, Mrs. Bell's son." Holmes's expression did not change. "Where is he?" "Not here." "He was dismissed yesterday." "For what reason?" The station master shrugged. "Sir Reginald accused him of stealing." That was the first genuine surprise I had seen on Holmes's face. We returned to Blackthorn Hall. Thomas Bell was nowhere to be found. His mother became visibly distressed when Holmes questioned her. "My boy would never hurt Sir Reginald. Did your son have a key to the railway warehouse?" She hesitated. "Yes." "Did Sir Reginald know?" "I believe so." "Why was Thomas dismissed?" "He was accused of taking money." Holmes leaned against the mantel. "Did he take it?" "I don't know." I watched Mrs. Bell's face. There was fear there, but not merely the fear of a mother whose son was missing. It was the expression of someone guarding a secret. Holmes noticed it too. "You may tell us the truth now, Mrs. Bell." She looked toward the door. "Thomas found something." "What?" "A letter." Holmes became very still. "Where?" "In Sir Reginald's study." "When?" "3 days ago." "What did the letter say?" "I don't know. Thomas could not read all of it. There were names and numbers." "Did he keep it?" "No." "Then where is it?" Mrs. Bell began to tremble. "Sir Reginald discovered that Thomas had seen it. He dismissed him the same day." Holmes looked at me. The significance of the missing letter, the railway key, and the mysterious glove was beginning to form a pattern, yet one piece remained impossible: the footprints. That evening, Holmes returned to the field alone. I followed him. The moon had appeared through the clouds, turning the snow silver. The air was bitter enough to sting the lungs, and each breath tasted of ice. Holmes walked slowly along the 3 trails. Then he stopped. "Watson." "Yes? How many footprints do you see?" 3 trails. "Incorrect." He pointed. The 3rd trail had been made by a boot with a damaged heel. The impression appeared several times, then stopped abruptly. Holmes walked beyond it. There were no footprints. Yet another trail began 20 feet farther toward the river. I stared. How could someone have crossed that distance without leaving a mark? Holmes smiled. "They didn't." He pointed upward. A narrow wooden cable stretched between 2 trees, almost invisible against the darkness. "The old ferry line," he said. "Someone used it." I stared at the cable. So the 3rd person crossed above the snow? Not quite. Holmes examined the rope. It was used to move something. What? He pointed toward the river. A small wooden sled lay beneath the trees. Its runners were packed with ice. Suddenly, the entire field seemed different. Holmes had discovered that the footprints were not simply evidence of people walking through the snow. They had been arranged to tell a story. I confess I failed to understand the full significance then. The answer was before us, but I could not yet see it. Holmes, however, was staring toward the dark river with that familiar intensity in his eyes. Someone wanted us to believe 3 people came to the boathouse. And they didn't? One did. Then who made the other tracks? Holmes looked back toward Blackthorn Hall. Someone who wanted us to look in the wrong direction. At that moment, a distant sound came across the river. A whistle. 3 short blasts. Holmes immediately reached for his revolver. "Stay behind me, Watson." The whistle came again, this time much closer, and from somewhere beyond the trees, we heard the unmistakable crunch of footsteps in fresh snow. Chapter 4. Fanning the Flames. The following morning, St. Mary Mead awoke beneath a blanket of silver fog. The church bell sounded faintly through the mist, while horse-drawn carts rattled along the wet village road, and the gas lamps remained glowing long after sunrise. At Blackthorn Manor, however, nobody seemed to notice the weather. The murder had turned every room into a place of suspicion. Miss Marple arrived shortly after 9. Inspector Slack was waiting for her in the entrance hall. "We've found something," he said. "Something useful?" "That depends." Miss Marple smiled. "Then it is probably interesting." Slack led her toward the library. On the desk lay Peter Hale's blue wool scarf. It had been found in the greenhouse. Slack looked satisfied. "That's enough to place him there." Miss Marple picked up the scarf carefully. "No." Slack frowned. "You've seen the fiber." "Yes." "And the scarf matches." "Yes." "Then why isn't it enough?" "Because Peter Hale knows we found the fiber." Slack stared at her. "What does that matter?" "It matters because someone wanted us to find this scarf." She placed it back on the desk. "The evidence is too convenient." Inspector Slack sighed. "You said that yesterday, and it remains true today." He led her toward the greenhouse. The door stood open. Inside, the damp smell of soil and leaves filled the air. A cracked window allowed cold morning air to enter, stirring the hanging vines. On the floor was the place where the scarf had supposedly been discovered. Miss Marple crouched. Was it here? Yes. Exactly here? Yes. She looked at the ground. There were footprints, police boots, a gardener's boots, and one smaller impression near the workbench. Miss Marple pointed. Whose is that? Slack examined it. We're not sure. Miss Marple smiled. A small ember. She stood and walked toward the door. Where is Mrs. Gibbons? In the kitchen. Take me there. They found the housekeeper preparing breakfast. Miss Marple sat at the kitchen table. Mrs. Gibbons, did you clean the greenhouse yesterday? No. Who did? The gardener. Did he move anything? I don't know. Miss Marple watched her carefully. You seem nervous. I am nervous. Why? A man has been murdered in this house. That is true. Mrs. Gibbons lowered her eyes. Miss Marple continued. Did you know Peter Hale owned a blue scarf? No. Did you know a piece of blue wool was found beneath the library window? No. Did you know the police found a blue fiber in the greenhouse? No. Miss Marple paused. Then why did you look toward the door when I mentioned it? Mrs. Gibbons froze. Slack stepped forward. Mrs. Gibbons? I don't know. Miss Marple raised a hand. Please. Her voice was gentle. Let her think. The woman slowly sat down. I saw someone in the greenhouse. When? 2 nights ago. Who? I couldn't see. Man or woman? A woman. Slack immediately reached for his notebook. What did she look like? Dark coat. Anything else? Mrs. Gibbons shook her head. Miss Marple asked quietly, did she carry anything? The housekeeper hesitated. A small box. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. The brass box from the drawer. Another ember. But before she could ask more, a loud crash came from the hallway. Everyone turned. Edward Bantry stood beside a broken vase. I dropped it, he said. Miss Marple looked at him. Of course. But Edward was breathing heavily. Too heavily. He had been listening. That afternoon, Miss Marple asked Edward to walk with her through the garden. The fog had lifted, leaving the paths wet and shining beneath a pale winter sun. You know, she said, your uncle's death has changed everything. Edward said nothing. Were you close to him? No. But you wanted his money? Yes. Did you argue with him the night he died? Yes. Did you leave the billiard room? No. Miss Marple stopped. Never. Edward hesitated. I went outside for a few minutes. When? About 10:20. Why? To smoke. Miss Marple looked at his shoes. No mud. You didn't go through the garden? No. Where did you smoke? On the terrace. Miss Marple nodded. Then why did you tell Inspector Slack you remained in the billiard room? Edward looked embarrassed. Because I thought leaving would make me look guilty. Miss Marple smiled. An understandable mistake. They continued walking. Edward suddenly stopped. What are you looking for? Something that doesn't belong. He stared at her. Have you found it? Not yet. That evening, Miss Marple asked to see Sir Julian. He arrived at the manor wearing a dark overcoat and carrying his polished walking stick. Miss Marple pointed toward it. May I? He handed it to her. She examined the brass tip, still spotless. You were in the garden? No. Yet your boots had red clay. Yes. Where did it come from? Sir Julian frowned. I don't know. Miss Marple looked at his trousers. There was a tiny smear of clay near the cuff. She touched nothing. Interesting. Sir Julian became irritated. You seem determined to suspect me. My dear Sir Julian, I am determined to suspect everyone equally. That is hardly reassuring. It isn't meant to be. He stood. I had nothing to do with Colonel Bantry's death. Miss Marple studied him. I believe you. He looked surprised. You do? Yes. Why? Because you are angry about the accusation. Sir Julian stared. Miss Marple smiled. Guilty people often fear the consequences. Innocent people are usually offended by the injustice. She watched him leave. Another false fire. But where was the true flame? That night, Inspector Slack brought Miss Marple an unexpected discovery. The Colonel's desk had a hidden compartment. Inside was a small envelope. No name, no address, only a date. November 14th. Slack opened it. Inside was a single sentence. Meet me at the greenhouse. Come alone. Miss Marple read it twice. When was this written? Yesterday morning. By whom? We don't know. She looked at the handwriting, then at the blackmail note. Her expression changed. The same person. Slack leaned closer. You're certain? No. But you think so? Yes. Miss Marple folded the letter. Inspector, I think the murderer expected Colonel Bantry to meet someone in the greenhouse. And then? He never made it. Slack frowned. Why? Miss Marple looked toward the dark garden. Because someone else got there first. The fire in the library crackled behind them. Outside, the greenhouse stood black against the fog. The scarf, the brass box, the secret letter, the false footprints, the clay. One by one, the false flames were burning out. Only one remained, and it was beginning to burn much brighter. False fires died. The true flame burned brighter. Chapter 5. The Fire Catches. By the next evening, the fog had returned to St. Mary Mead with unusual thickness, turning Blackthorn Manor into a shadowy island of stone and glass. The gas lamps along the drive glowed like small yellow moons, while rain whispered against the windows, and the old house settled uneasily beneath the November night. Inside, Inspector Slack had gathered everyone in the drawing room, but Miss Marple remained near the fireplace, quietly knitting as though nothing of importance were happening. Yet everything had changed. The letter found inside Colonel Bantry's desk had given them their first real direction. Meet me at the greenhouse. Come alone. The handwriting appeared identical to that on the threatening note found beneath the rose bushes. Slack placed both pieces of paper on the table. Same hand, he said. Miss Marple nodded. Almost certainly. Peter Hale stood near the window, his arms folded. I told you I knew nothing about those letters. Miss Marple looked at him. No, Mr. Hale, you told us you knew nothing about the Colonel's personal affairs. Peter's face tightened. That isn't the same thing. No. She smiled gently. That is why I remembered it. A silence fell over the room. Miss Marple had learned something important during her years of observing people. When someone tells a lie, they often remember the lie rather than the truth. Their answers become precise in places where precision is unnecessary. Peter had been very precise. Too precise. Inspector Slack stepped forward. We found another piece of evidence. He opened his hand. A small brass key lay in his palm. We found this beneath the Colonel's desk. Miss Marple examined it. What does it open? We don't know. Then we should find out. They searched the library, drawer after drawer, cabinet after cabinet. Nothing. Then Miss Marple noticed the grandfather clock. She walked toward it. Inspector. Slack followed. What? The clock. It stopped at 10:17. Yes. Miss Marple touched the wooden frame. Was it always here? Yes. Could it be moved? Slack pushed it gently. The clock shifted. Behind it was a narrow wooden door. Slack stared. How did I miss that? Miss Marple smiled. Because you were looking for a secret compartment. And sometimes the secret is simply behind the furniture. The key fitted the lock. The door opened with a soft click. A narrow service corridor stretched into darkness. The smell of damp wood and old dust filled the passage. Slack raised his lantern. Where does this lead? To the greenhouse, Miss Marple said. They followed it. The corridor ended at a small door concealed behind a wooden panel near the greenhouse. Miss Marple examined the floor. There were marks, fresh marks. Someone had recently dragged something heavy across the boards. Slack crouched. Blood? Miss Marple shook her head. Wax. Wax? She pointed toward a small white fragment. From a candle. Slack looked confused. Why would someone carry a candle when the house has gas lamps? Miss Marple smiled. Because they did not want to be seen. The meaning of the corridor became clear. The murderer could enter and leave the library without using the main hall. No one would see them, no servant would question them, and no one would know they had been there. Miss Marple's eyes moved toward the greenhouse. Now we know how. Slack looked at her. But we still don't know who. Miss Marple nodded. That is the important question. They returned to the drawing room. Miss Marple asked Mrs. Bantry to come with her. The two women stood near the fireplace. Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple said quietly, you told us you went upstairs after speaking to your husband. Yes, but you didn't. Mrs. Bantry looked frightened. I did go upstairs. Eventually. The woman looked down. You were in the greenhouse. Mrs. Bantry's face changed. Yes. Why? She hesitated. Then she whispered, Arthur asked me to meet him there. Slack stepped forward. Why didn't you tell us? Because I was ashamed. Of what? My husband had discovered that I knew about the blackmail letters. Miss Marple nodded. And what happened in the greenhouse? I arrived at 10:15. Was Colonel Bantry there? No. Did you wait? Yes. How long? About 10 minutes. Did you see anyone? Mrs. Bantry hesitated. Yes. Who? I don't know. Man or woman? A woman. Slack's eyes widened. Could you identify her? No. She was wearing a dark coat and a hat. Miss Marple's expression remained calm. Did she see you? I don't think so. Where did she go? Toward the service corridor. Another ember. Miss Marple thanked her. Then she turned toward the room. Everyone was watching. Peter Hale, Edward Bantry, Sir Julian Carr, Mrs. Gibbons, 5 people, 1 murderer. But Miss Marple suddenly realized that the murderer had made a mistake. Not with the gun, not with the window, not even with the false evidence. The mistake was in the timing. She looked at the clock. 10:17. Mrs. Bantry had arrived at 10:15. The murderer had entered the greenhouse shortly afterward. Colonel Bantry had already been dead by 10:17, but the police had believed the murder occurred closer to 10:30. The entire alibi structure had been built around a false time of death. Miss Marple turned toward Inspector Slack. Have the medical examiner return. Slack looked surprised. Why? Because I believe he was wrong. The doctor arrived an hour later. He examined his notes. Based on the body's temperature, I estimated death between 10:15 and 10:30. Miss Marple pointed toward the fireplace. The fire was burning? Yes. Strongly? Yes. Then the room was warmer than you assumed. The doctor paused. Miss Marple continued. And you did not account for the heated water bottle found beside the colonel's chair. The doctor looked embarrassed. No. Then your estimate was too late. He reconsidered his notes. Yes. What is the revised time? He looked up. Approximately 10:17. Silence. Miss Marple's eyes moved across the room. 10:17. The clock. The greenhouse. The false alibis. Everything had shifted. Peter Hale could no longer claim he was working upstairs until 10:30. Edward's movements mattered. Sir Julian's journey mattered. Mrs. Gibbons's statement mattered. But one person had the greatest problem. Mrs. Gibbons. She had claimed she heard the clock strike 10:30, yet the clock had stopped at 10:17. Miss Marple looked at her. Why did you say you heard it? Mrs. Gibbons began to tremble. I don't know. You do. No. You were in the service corridor. The woman stepped backward. You saw the murderer. I didn't. You heard the shot. No! You heard the shot because you were close enough to hear it. Mrs. Gibbons's face had gone completely white. Miss Marple's voice softened. You were frightened, weren't you? The woman covered her mouth. Yes. Why? I thought they would kill me too. Slack stepped toward her. Who? Mrs. Gibbons looked around the room. Her eyes stopped on one person. Miss Marple followed her gaze. Peter Hale. Peter suddenly moved. He rushed toward the door. Inspector Slack caught him before he reached it. The room erupted in confusion. Peter struggled violently. "You have no proof." Miss Marple stood perfectly still. "No," she said. "Not yet." Peter stared at her. She looked at the others. "The fire has caught." She picked up the blackmail letter. "Now we simply have to discover who lit the match." Outside, thunder rolled over St. Mary Mead. The greenhouse disappeared into the darkness, and for the first time, the murderer understood that Miss Marple was no longer merely watching. She was closing in. The fire caught. Nothing could extinguish it now. Chapter 6. The Spreading Blaze. The struggle in the drawing room lasted only a few seconds, but to Miss Marple it seemed to reveal more than hours of questioning ever could. Inspector Slack forced Peter Hale back against the wall, while the young secretary stared wildly from one face to another, his carefully controlled expression finally shattered. Outside, rain hammered against the tall windows, and the gas lamps trembled in the draught, as though the old manor itself had become uneasy. "You have no proof!" Peter shouted again. Inspector Slack tightened his grip. "Then perhaps you can explain why you tried to run." Peter said nothing. Miss Marple watched him carefully. She had seen that expression before, not in a murderer necessarily, in a man who had realized that a secret was about to escape. "There is a difference," Miss Marple said quietly, "between guilt and fear." Peter looked at her. "You are afraid, Mr. Hale." "I've done nothing." "I didn't say you had." That answer unsettled him more than an accusation would have. Miss Marple turned to Inspector Slack. "Take Mr. Hale somewhere private." Slack hesitated. "Why?" "Because if we question him here, he will continue protecting someone." Peter's face changed. Only slightly, but Miss Marple saw it. Someone, not himself, another ember. Peter was taken into the library. Miss Marple followed. The room was colder now. The fire had burned low, leaving a bed of red coals beneath a layer of ash. The smell of smoke and old wood filled the air, while rainwater tapped steadily against the glass. Peter sat at the desk. Inspector Slack stood opposite him. Miss Marple remained near the fireplace. "Tell us about the blackmail letters," Slack said. Peter looked down. "I already told you." "No. You told us what you wanted us to know." Peter swallowed. Miss Marple spoke softly. "Who wrote them?" "I don't know." "Who knew about them?" Peter hesitated. "The Colonel." "Mrs. Bantry?" "Yes." "Sir Julian?" "Yes." "Edward?" "I don't think so." "And Mrs. Gibbons?" Peter's eyes flickered. Miss Marple noticed. "Ah." Peter closed his eyes. "Ah. She knew. How?" "She found one." "When?" "3 weeks ago." "What did she do with it?" "Nothing." Miss Marple walked closer. "Nothing?" "She threatened to tell the Colonel." "Why?" Peter looked toward the door. "Because she knew what I had been doing." Inspector Slack leaned forward. "What had you been doing?" Peter finally spoke. "I was stealing from him." Silence. "Small amounts," he continued. "Nothing that would be noticed immediately. I needed money. Then came the blackmail." Peter nodded. "I discovered something in his papers, something about his military service." Miss Marple's expression remained neutral. "What did you discover?" "A report." "What kind?" "An old disciplinary report." Peter hesitated. The Colonel had blamed another officer for something that wasn't entirely his fault. Slack frowned. "And?" "The officer lost his career." Miss Marple looked into the fire. There it was, the secret behind the blackmail. But it was not enough. "You demanded money from Colonel Bantry." "Yes." "How much?" £500. "Did he agree?" "No." "What did he say?" Peter looked bitter. "He said he would expose me." Miss Marple nodded. "And then someone else discovered your blackmail." Peter said nothing. "Who?" His eyes moved toward the hallway. Miss Marple followed them. But before she could speak, Mrs. Gibbons entered. She carried a tray. Her hands were shaking. "Tea," she whispered. Miss Marple watched her place the tray on the table. Then she noticed something. A tiny smear of dark wax on the cuff of Mrs. Gibbons's sleeve, the same wax found in the secret corridor. Miss Marple looked at the woman. "Where did you get that?" Mrs. Gibbons immediately covered her sleeve. "What? The wax? I don't know. You were in the corridor." "No. You used a candle." Mrs. Gibbons began trembling. "I only carried it once." "When?" "The night Colonel Bantry died." Slack stepped forward. "Why?" Mrs. Gibbons stared at him. "I heard a noise." "What kind?" "A door." "Which door?" "The service door." Miss Marple remained silent. Mrs. Gibbons continued. "I went to see what it was. And I saw Peter." Peter looked up sharply. "You're lying." Mrs. Gibbons shook her head. "You were carrying something." "What?" "A small brass box." Peter went pale. Miss Marple's mind raced. The brass box from the greenhouse, the missing letters, the service corridor. Peter had carried the box. But why? "Where did you take it?" Miss Marple asked. Peter remained silent. "Mr. Hale?" Finally he whispered, "The greenhouse." Slack stared. "Why?" "To meet the Colonel." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "But the Colonel never arrived." "No." "Why?" Peter looked at the floor. "Because someone stopped him." The room became silent. Miss Marple turned toward the window. The pieces were moving now. The blackmail had begun with Peter, but the murder had not. Someone else had known about the meeting. Someone else had reached the Colonel first, and that person had used Peter's crime as the perfect cover. Miss Marple suddenly understood the purpose of the false evidence, the blue scarf, the red clay, the open window, the false time. All of it had been designed to make the police believe the murder was committed by an outsider or by one of the obvious suspects. But the murderer had made one mistake. They had known too much about Peter, too much about the Colonel, too much about the house, and too much about how the police would investigate. Miss Marple turned toward Mrs. Gibbons. "You were watching the service corridor." The woman looked frightened. "Yes? What did you see?" "I saw a woman." "Was she Mrs. Bantry?" "No." "Could you see her face?" "No." "What was she wearing?" "A dark coat." "Anything else?" Mrs. Gibbons closed her eyes. "A blue scarf." Miss Marple went still. "Peter's scarf." But the scarf had been found in the greenhouse, which meant someone had taken it. Someone had wanted it there. Miss Marple turned toward Peter. "Your scarf." Peter looked confused. "I didn't lose it." "No," Miss Marple said. "Someone took it." A long silence followed. Inspector Slack stared at her. "Who?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. She walked to the fireplace and looked down at the dying embers. She thought about human nature. People rarely invented complicated lies unless they were trying to conceal a simple truth. The murderer had needed a disguise. Peter's scarf had provided it. The service corridor had provided the route. The greenhouse had provided the false trail. And the Colonel's own pistol had provided the weapon. But why had the murderer killed him? That was the final question. Miss Marple turned. "Inspector, we need to search Colonel Bantry's study again." Slack frowned. "We've searched it 3 times. Then search it a 4th. "Why?" "Because we were looking for evidence of the murder." She smiled faintly. "Now we must look for evidence of the motive." They returned to the study. The room was dark except for the glow from the fireplace. Miss Marple examined the desk, the drawers, the books, the papers. Then she noticed a photograph. It showed Colonel Bantry standing beside several military officers many years earlier. One man had been scratched out. Miss Marple picked up the frame. "Who is this?" Slack examined it. "I don't know." Mrs. Bantry entered behind them. The moment she saw the photograph, she stopped. Miss Marple turned. "You know him?" Mrs. Bantry looked away. "Yes." "Who?" She whispered a name. "Captain Henry Gibbons." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Mrs. Gibbons's husband. Dead for 15 years. The man Colonel Bantry had blamed. The man whose career had been destroyed. The man whose widow still worked in the house. Suddenly, the entire mystery seemed to breathe. Mrs. Gibbons had not merely been a servant, she had been living beside the man she believed had destroyed her husband's life. Miss Marple closed her eyes. The motive was no longer hidden. The blaze was spreading. But one question remained. Why had Mrs. Gibbons waited 15 years? And what had finally made her strike? Miss Marple looked into the fire. The answer, she suspected, was hidden in the old military report. The blaze illuminated what had long been hidden in shadow. Chapter 7. The Conflagration. The old military photograph had changed everything. For several minutes, nobody in the study spoke. Rain beat against the windows of Blackthorn Manor, and the fire in the grate threw restless shadows across the walls. Miss Marple stood beside the desk, holding the photograph carefully between her fingers, while Inspector Slack stared at the scratched-out figure of Captain Henry Gibbons. Mrs. Gibbons remained near the doorway. Her face had become very pale. "Your husband," Miss Marple said gently, "was Captain Henry Gibbons." Mrs. Gibbons nodded. "And Colonel Bantry was responsible for his disgrace." "He said he was." Miss Marple lowered the photograph. "Tell us what happened." Mrs. Gibbons looked toward the fire. "Henry served with the colonel overseas. There was an incident involving missing military funds. Colonel Bantry gave evidence against him." "Was your husband guilty?" "No." The answer came immediately. He was innocent. Inspector Slack frowned. But the official report was false. Mrs. Gibbons's voice trembled. Arthur Bantry lied. The room fell silent. Miss Marple looked at the photograph again. "Why?" Mrs. Gibbons shook her head. "I never knew. Henry lost everything. His rank, his reputation, his friends. He came home broken. And then he died." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "How long ago?" 15 years. Slack looked toward the woman. "And you stayed here?" "I had nowhere else to go." A strange silence followed. 15 years. 15 years of cooking meals for the man she believed had destroyed her husband. 15 years of cleaning his rooms. 15 years of watching him live comfortably while Henry's name remained ruined. Miss Marple understood the danger of buried resentment. People rarely forgot pain. They simply learned to live beside it, until something disturbed the ashes. "What happened recently?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Gibbons looked at her. "Recently? What made you act now?" The woman began to cry. Arthur found the old report. Slack stepped forward. "What report?" "The original." Miss Marple's expression sharpened. "Where is it?" Mrs. Gibbons pointed toward the desk. "He discovered that someone had kept a copy." "Who?" "Peter Hale." Peter, standing near the door, suddenly spoke. "I didn't know what it meant." Miss Marple turned toward him. "But you knew it was valuable." Peter said nothing. Mrs. Gibbons continued. "Peter showed it to me." The room became very still. "He told me Arthur had lied," she whispered. "He told me the original report could prove Henry was innocent." Miss Marple understood. The blackmail had not begun because of money alone. Peter had discovered the report. Mrs. Gibbons had discovered the truth, and Colonel Bantry had realized that his secret was finally in danger. Miss Marple turned to Peter. "You threatened Colonel Bantry with the report." "Yes." "You demanded money." "Yes." "But you didn't kill him." "No." "Because you were in the greenhouse waiting for him." Peter nodded. "I wanted him to pay, and someone else knew about the meeting." Peter looked at Mrs. Gibbons. She knew. Mrs. Gibbons closed her eyes. "Yes." Miss Marple walked slowly toward her. "You followed Colonel Bantry." "Yes." "You took Peter's scarf." "Yes." "You wore it to make him appear responsible." Mrs. Gibbons began sobbing. "Yes." Inspector Slack stared. "Then you killed Colonel Bantry." Mrs. Gibbons covered her face. "Yes." The confession seemed to drain the strength from the room, but Miss Marple was not finished. "One thing remains." Mrs. Gibbons looked up. "The clock. I stopped it. Why?" "To make the police believe the murder happened later." "And the open window?" "I opened it. The blue wool beneath it. I tore it from the scarf. The red clay. I brought it from the garden. The brass box. I moved it. Slack stared at her. You planned everything. Mrs. Gibbons shook her head. I planned only to frighten him. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. But you took the pistol. He came at me. And? He threatened to call the police. Then you fired. Mrs. Gibbons nodded. One shot. The room seemed to shrink around them. Miss Marple looked at the pistol on the table. Then at the clock. Then at the window. Every ember now had a place. The first clue was the open window, she said. Everyone listened. It was unnatural on such a cold night. The murderer wanted us to believe someone had entered from outside. She pointed toward the garden. The second was the red clay. It suggested that the killer had crossed the garden. Then the blue wool. The third clue connected Peter to the scene. She turned toward Peter, but it was too obvious. Peter looked miserable. Miss Marple continued. The fourth clue was the clock. It gave us a false time of death. She looked toward Mrs. Gibbons. And the fifth was the statement of the housekeeper herself. Mrs. Gibbons lowered her eyes. You said you heard the clock strike 10:30, but the clock stopped at 10:17. Miss Marple paused. You could not have heard it. Mrs. Gibbons whispered. No, you were lying. Yes. Not because you were the murderer. Mrs. Gibbons looked up. Because you were protecting the murderer. Miss Marple shook her head gently. No, you were protecting yourself. The distinction mattered. Mrs. Gibbons had not planned the murder as carefully as the evidence suggested. She had reacted. The elaborate false trail had grown from panic. The blue scarf had been a desperate attempt to divert suspicion. The window had been opened to suggest an outsider. The clock had been stopped to create time for an alibi. But Miss Marple had seen the weakness. A carefully planned murder rarely contains so many unnecessary clues. The killer had been trying too hard. Miss Marple turned toward Inspector Slack. You see, Inspector, the truth was never hidden. Slack nodded slowly. It was disguised. Exactly. She looked around the room. Every lie contained a piece of truth. Peter really had blackmailed Colonel Bantry. Mrs. Bantry really had gone to the greenhouse. Sir Julian really had been angry with the colonel. Edward really had needed money. Mrs. Gibbons really had been in the service corridor. The murderer had simply arranged those truths into a false story. Miss Marple smiled sadly. That is the danger of deception. A liar believes that if every piece of evidence points elsewhere, nobody will notice the pattern. She looked at Mrs. Gibbons. But you forgot one thing. What? You knew where everyone had been. Mrs. Gibbons stared. And I knew you knew. The room was silent. Inspector Slack finally stepped forward. Mrs. Gibbons, I must place you under arrest for the murder of Colonel Arthur Bantry. The housekeeper did not resist. She simply looked once toward the photograph of her husband. For 15 years, Henry Gibbons had remained a disgraced man. But now the truth would finally be known. His name would be cleared. And Colonel Bantry's lie would die with him. As Mrs. Gibbons was led away, Miss Marple remained beside the fire. Inspector Slack approached. I admit it. Miss Marple looked up. What? You were right. She smiled. About which part? The whole thing. Miss Marple gave a quiet laugh. That is dangerous praise, Inspector. Why? Because it may encourage you to ask for my help again. Slack smiled despite himself. Outside, the rain had stopped. The fog was beginning to lift, and through the window, the first pale light of morning touched the wet garden. The truth had finally burned through every lie. Truth blazed forth. No darkness could survive such light. Chapter 8. Ashes and Justice. By the time the sun rose over St. Mary Mead, the fog had finally begun to surrender. Pale morning light spread across the wet fields, catching upon every leaf and stone, while thin ribbons of mist still clung to the hedges surrounding Blackthorn Manor. Inside the house, however, the atmosphere remained heavy, for the arrest of Mrs. Gibbons had left behind the peculiar silence that follows the end of a terrible secret. Inspector Slack stood in the entrance hall as the officers prepared to take her away. Mrs. Gibbons wore the same dark dress she had worn the previous evening. Her hands were trembling, but her expression had become strangely calm. After 15 years of silence, perhaps there was some relief in finally allowing the truth to escape. Miss Marple stood nearby. She watched the officers escort the housekeeper toward the front door. Mrs. Gibbons stopped. "Miss Marple." Miss Marple turned. "Yes? Will they believe me?" The question was not about the murder. Miss Marple understood immediately. "You mean about your husband?" Mrs. Gibbons nodded. "Henry was innocent." Miss Marple's expression softened. "Yes," she said, "I believe they will." Mrs. Gibbons closed her eyes. For 15 years, she had carried the belief that her husband's name had been destroyed by Colonel Bantry's lie. Now, at last, the evidence existed to challenge the old military report. Inspector Slack approached. "We'll investigate the original documents." Mrs. Gibbons nodded. Then she was led outside. The door closed behind her. For several seconds, nobody moved. Edward Bantry finally spoke. "It's difficult to believe." Miss Marple looked at him. "Which part?" "That she lived here all these years." "Yes, and nobody knew what she felt." Miss Marple smiled sadly. "That is the trouble with people, Edward. We often notice what they say and forget to notice what they carry." Edward looked toward the empty corridor. "I thought I understood my uncle." "Did you?" "No, neither did most people." He looked down. "I hated him." Miss Marple did not contradict him. "But hatred and murder are not the same thing." Edward looked surprised. "I suppose not. You were angry because he refused to give you money. That made you suspicious in the eyes of the police. But anger is not evidence of murder." Edward nodded slowly. Then his expression changed. "What happens to the estate?" Miss Marple smiled. "There you are." He laughed, despite himself. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It is perfectly human." Outside, a carriage passed along the road, its wheels splashing through puddles left by the night's rain. Somewhere in the village, shopkeepers were opening their doors, and the distant church bell announced the beginning of another ordinary day. But St. Mary Mead was not entirely ordinary anymore. News traveled quickly. By breakfast, everyone knew Mrs. Gibbons had confessed. By 10 o'clock, everyone had an opinion. Mrs. Price, from the village bakery, declared that she had always found the housekeeper suspicious. The postmaster claimed he had never trusted her. A neighbor insisted she had noticed something strange weeks earlier. Miss Marple listened to these stories without correcting anyone. She knew that memory had a curious way of improving itself after a mystery was solved. People remembered clues they had never actually noticed. They transformed ordinary observations into prophetic warnings. That afternoon, Inspector Slack visited Miss Marple at her cottage. She was sitting beside the fire, knitting. "I have something for you," he said. He placed a folder on the table. The military report. Miss Marple opened it. The pages were yellow with age. At the top was the name, Captain Henry Gibbons. Below it were allegations concerning missing funds and misconduct. Miss Marple read silently. Then she frowned. "Inspector." "Yes?" "This report is incomplete." Slack looked surprised. "How?" "Look here." She pointed to the final page. "There should be a witness statement." "There isn't one." "Exactly." Slack leaned closer. "The original report may have contained additional evidence, or evidence that contradicted Colonel Bantry." Miss Marple closed the folder. "That is what Mrs. Gibbons believed." Slack nodded. "We've contacted the War Office. They're searching their archives." "Good. If the missing statement proves Captain Gibbons was innocent, the record can be corrected." Miss Marple smiled. "That may be the justice she wanted most." Slack sat down. "You know, I've been thinking about the murder. That is always dangerous," he laughed. "How did you know Mrs. Gibbons would confess?" "I didn't." "But you seemed certain." I was certain of something else. What? She was tired. Tired. Of lying. Miss Marple looked toward the fire. People can maintain a lie for years when they believe the lie protects them. But once the truth begins to emerge, maintaining it becomes exhausting. Slack nodded thoughtfully. She had lost the reason to hide. Exactly. There was a pause. Then Slack said, "There's something I still don't understand." "What?" "The scarf." Miss Marple smiled. "Peter's scarf?" "Yes. Mrs. Gibbons took it." "But why didn't Peter notice?" "Because she borrowed it earlier." "Borrowed it?" "She told him she needed something warm while working in the garden." Slack shook his head. "And he never thought twice about it. People rarely remember insignificant things." Miss Marple returned to her knitting. That was the entire weakness in the murder. The clues had seemed unrelated. The blue wool, the red clay, the silk thread, the stopped clock, the brass box, the candle wax. But together they formed a story, and once the story was understood, the lies collapsed. That evening, Mrs. Bantry came to Miss Marple's cottage. She looked more peaceful than she had since the murder. "I wanted to thank you. You have already done so." "I don't think I have." Mrs. Bantry sat near the fire. "I was afraid everyone would believe I killed Arthur." Miss Marple smiled. "You did not help yourself by hiding the letters." "I know. Why did you destroy them?" Mrs. Bantry looked down. "Because one of them mentioned something Arthur had done years ago. I didn't want the village to know." Miss Marple nodded. "That is understandable." "Do you think people will forgive me?" "People forgive much more easily than we imagine." Mrs. Bantry smiled sadly. "I don't know whether I can forgive Arthur." Miss Marple looked at the fire. "Forgiveness is not always necessary." "What is?" "Understanding." Mrs. Bantry looked toward her. "Understanding what?" "That people are rarely entirely good or entirely bad." The words remained between them. Colonel Bantry had been proud and cruel. Peter Hale had been dishonest. Edward had been reckless. Sir Julian had been threatening. Mrs. Bantry had hidden evidence. Mrs. Gibbons had committed murder. Yet none of them could be reduced to a single action. That was the uncomfortable truth about human nature. Miss Marple knew it better than most. Before Mrs. Bantry left, she turned at the door. "Will you continue helping the police?" Miss Marple smiled. "I don't help the police." "No? I merely notice things." Mrs. Bantry laughed. "I think Inspector Slack would disagree. He is entitled to." The door closed. Miss Marple returned to her chair. The fire crackled softly. The house was quiet. Outside, the evening fog began creeping back over St. Mary Mead. But it no longer seemed threatening. The mystery had burned away. What remained were the ashes, pain, regret, justice, and perhaps, eventually, peace. Miss Marple looked into the glowing fireplace. Every murder leaves something behind. Sometimes it is evidence. Sometimes it is grief. Sometimes it is a name that must finally be cleared. For Captain Henry Gibbons, justice had begun 15 years too late. But justice had begun, and that was what mattered. From ashes, justice rose, as it always must. Chapter 9. The Last Shadow. 3 days had passed since Mrs. Gibbons had been arrested. St. Mary Mead had already begun returning to its ordinary rhythm. The bakery opened at 7, the church bell sounded every hour, and village ladies resumed their morning walks along the narrow lanes. Yet Blackthorn Manor remained strangely quiet. The police had finished their examination. The library had been cleaned. The greenhouse had been locked. The servants had returned to their duties. But Miss Marple knew that a murder did not truly end with an arrest. There was always something left behind, a question, a doubt, or, occasionally, one last shadow. On Thursday morning, Inspector Slack arrived at Miss Marple's cottage carrying a thick brown envelope. "You were right," he said. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "About what?" "Captain Gibbons." She put down her needles. Slack placed the envelope on the table. The military archives found another document. Miss Marple opened it carefully. Inside was an old witness statement. She read it slowly. The statement had been written 15 years earlier by a junior officer who had been present when the missing funds were discovered. It contained one crucial detail. Captain Gibbons had not handled the money. Another officer had, and Colonel Bantry had known it. Miss Marple looked at Slack. So Henry Gibbons was innocent. Yes, and Colonel Bantry knew. We believe so. Why did he accuse him? Slack shook his head. We don't know. Miss Marple looked down at the document. Perhaps he was protecting someone. That's what we've been thinking. Who? Slack opened another paper. A name appeared. Major William Carr. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Carr. Sir Julian Carr's older brother. The room became very still. Miss Marple remembered the polished walking stick, the spotless brass tip, the land dispute, Sir Julian's anger, and the photograph. There had been several officers in it. One of them had been Major William Carr. Is he alive? No. When did he die? 10 years ago. Miss Marple nodded slowly. So Colonel Bantry may have protected him. Slack leaned back. That gives us another motive for the original lie, indeed. But it doesn't change Mrs. Gibbons's guilt, no. Miss Marple folded the document. She killed Colonel Bantry because she believed he destroyed her husband's life. Slack sighed. And now we discover there was another secret. Human beings are very fond of secrets, he smiled. There's something else. Miss Marple looked at him. What? The blue thread. She raised an eyebrow. We've identified it. Peter's scarf. No. Slack placed a small evidence bag on the table. The thread came from a different garment. Miss Marple examined it. Whose? Sir Julian Carr's coat. She became very still. His coat? Yes. But the coat was not found in the greenhouse. No. Where was it? His bedroom. Miss Marple studied the thread. Inspector, when did you discover this? Yesterday. Why didn't you tell me immediately? Slack hesitated. Because I wasn't sure what it meant. Miss Marple smiled. That is usually when a clue is most interesting. She stood. Take me to Blackthorn Manor. When they arrived, Sir Julian was waiting. He looked irritated. I have already answered your questions. Miss Marple smiled politely. I am not the police. I know. Then perhaps you will answer mine. He sighed. What do you want to know? Your brother. Sir Julian froze. My brother. Major William Carr. A long silence followed. What about him? Did Colonel Bantry know something about him? Sir Julian's expression hardened. I don't know. Miss Marple watched him. You do. No. Sir Julian, people usually become angry when they are accused of something. I am angry because you keep dragging my family into this. Precisely. He stared at her. Miss Marple continued. Your brother was connected to the missing funds. Sir Julian said nothing. Colonel Bantry accused Captain Gibbons. Still nothing. But the evidence now suggests your brother was responsible. Sir Julian's face changed. For a moment, the anger disappeared. Only exhaustion remained. My brother made a terrible mistake. Miss Marple waited. He was gambling, Sir Julian whispered. He borrowed money. Then he took the funds. Did Colonel Bantry know? Yes. Why didn't he expose him? Because William threatened him. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Threatened him with what? Sir Julian looked toward the window. William knew about another matter. What matter? My brother discovered that Colonel Bantry had been falsifying reports. Miss Marple understood. The corruption had been deeper than anyone realized. Colonel Bantry had accused Captain Gibbons, partly to protect himself. William Carr had stolen the money. Colonel Bantry had covered it up. And 15 years later, Peter Hale discovered the old report and began blackmailing Bantry. The old secret had finally returned. Miss Marple looked at Sir Julian. You knew. I suspected. And you confronted Colonel Bantry? Yes. When? The night he died. Inspector Slack stepped forward. You never told us that." Sir Julian looked ashamed. "I was afraid." Afraid of what? That the old scandal would become public. Miss Marple studied him. "What time did you speak to Colonel Bantry?" "About 9:45. "Where?" "His study." "Did you threaten him?" "No." "Did he threaten you?" Sir Julian gave a bitter smile. "He told me that if I continued investigating William's past, he would expose my brother's name." Miss Marple nodded. "And then?" "I left." "Did you go into the garden?" "No." "Did you see Mrs. Gibbons?" "No." His answers came calmly. Miss Marple believed him, but one thing still bothered her: the blue thread. "Sir Julian," she said, "what coat were you wearing that night?" "This one." He removed it. Miss Marple examined the sleeve. A tiny tear was visible near the cuff. She looked at Slack. The thread matched. But how? If Sir Julian had been nowhere near the greenhouse, why had part of his coat been found there? Miss Marple walked outside. She followed the path toward the greenhouse. Then she stopped. There was a small wooden bench beside the hedge. She examined it. A nail protruded from the side. The coat could easily have caught on it. She smiled. "Inspector." Slack joined her. She pointed toward the nail. "The thread doesn't prove Sir Julian entered the greenhouse." Slack nodded. "It could have caught here." "Exactly." The final shadow disappeared. The evidence against Sir Julian had been another accident, not a clue to murder, just another misleading fragment. Miss Marple looked toward Blackthorn Manor. The house no longer seemed sinister. It seemed tired, as though it had carried too many secrets for too long. That evening, Miss Marple returned home. She sat beside the fire and began knitting. Inspector Slack's voice echoed in her memory. "The case is finished." Perhaps it was. Yet Miss Marple knew something else. The truth was never simply about discovering who pulled the trigger. It was about understanding why people reached the point where they did terrible things. Mrs. Gibbons had wanted justice. Peter had wanted money. Colonel Bantry had wanted his secrets protected. Sir Julian had wanted his family's name preserved. Everyone had been protecting something, and protection, when taken too far, could become destruction. Miss Marple looked at the glowing embers. The fire was nearly out. Only a few red sparks remained. She smiled. The last shadow had disappeared, but somewhere beneath the ashes, the truth remained warm. And that was enough. Chapter 10. The Quiet Morning. The morning after the final investigation, St. Mary Mead seemed almost unnaturally peaceful. Sunlight poured through the bedroom curtains of Miss Marple's cottage, touching the silver needles of her knitting and warming the little cup of tea beside her chair. Outside, birds moved among the hedges, and somewhere down the lane a milk cart rattled over the stones. It was difficult to imagine that only days earlier, Blackthorn Manor had been filled with policemen, whispers, accusations, and fear. Miss Marple preferred mornings like this. Quiet mornings allowed people to return to their ordinary selves. And ordinary selves, she had always believed, were much more revealing than frightened ones. At 10 o'clock there was a knock at the door. Inspector Slack entered, carrying his hat beneath his arm. "The papers have arrived," he said. Miss Marple looked up. "Captain Gibbons?" Slack nodded. "The military authorities have confirmed the witness statement. Captain Gibbons was innocent." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I thought so. They're going to correct the official record. That will mean a great deal to Mrs. Gibbons." Slack sat opposite her. "She'll still stand trial." "Yes." "Do you think the court will understand?" Miss Marple placed her knitting aside. "I hope they understand the difference between sympathy and innocence." Slack nodded. "She committed murder." "Yes." "But her husband was wrongfully accused." "Yes, and Colonel Bantry had deceived everyone." Miss Marple looked toward the window. "Human beings can be responsible for terrible things without being responsible for everything that happens afterward." Slack smiled. "You always make it sound simple." "No, Inspector." She picked up her knitting again. "I merely try to keep the pieces separate. For a while they sat quietly. Then Slack reached into his pocket. "There is one more thing." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "A final surprise. Perhaps." He handed her a small envelope. She opened it. Inside was a photograph. It showed Captain Henry Gibbons in uniform, young and smiling. On the back was written, "For my wife, who never stopped believing me." Miss Marple's expression softened. "Where did you find this?" "In an old box belonging to Colonel Bantry." She turned the photograph over again. "Then perhaps he kept it because he felt guilty," Slack shrugged. "Or because he couldn't forget." Miss Marple looked into the fire. Guilt and memory often live in the same room. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited Blackthorn Manor one final time. The house looked different. Perhaps it was the sunlight. Perhaps it was simply that she no longer expected danger around every corner. The library windows were open. Fresh air moved through the room. The desk had been cleared. The old clock had been repaired. Its hands now moved steadily. Tick, tick, tick. Miss Marple stood before it. 10:17. The time that had become so important, the moment around which the entire false story had been built. She smiled. A clock was supposed to tell time, but sometimes, she thought, people told clocks what they wanted them to say. Inspector Slack entered behind her. "Everything is finished." "Everything?" "The investigation." Miss Marple looked around. "And the people?" Slack smiled. "They'll have to finish their own stories." Edward Bantry had decided to leave St. Mary Mead for a while. He planned to work abroad and make something of himself without relying on his uncle's money. Peter Hale had confessed to the thefts and blackmail attempts. His future would be uncertain, but he had avoided being charged with murder. Sir Julian Carr had agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation into his brother's past, and Mrs. Bantry had remained at Blackthorn Manor. She had not decided what she would do with the house. Perhaps she would sell it. Perhaps she would stay. Perhaps, Miss Marple thought, she had not yet decided whether she was mourning her husband or mourning the man she had once believed him to be. Miss Marple walked into the greenhouse. The place was bright now. New flowers had been planted. The soil had been turned over. Nothing remained of the night when Colonel Bantry had been killed. Yet Miss Marple stopped beside the old workbench. She remembered the brass box, the blue scarf, the candle, the secret corridor. She remembered how easily every clue had seemed to point in the wrong direction. The murderer had believed that by creating enough confusion, she could hide the truth. But confusion had become her weakness. Too many clues, too many lies, too many details that did not belong together. Miss Marple smiled. "People always think a mystery is solved by finding one extraordinary clue," she said. Slack looked at her. "And it isn't?" "No." "What is it, then?" "Noticing ordinary things." She pointed toward the greenhouse door. A scarf. Then the workbench. A box. Then the floor. Mud. Then the corridor. A candle. She smiled. None of them mattered by themselves. But together, they told a story. Slack nodded. They walked back toward the house. At the front door, Miss Marple stopped. She looked across the grounds. The fog was gone. For the first time since the murder, the manor stood completely clear beneath the afternoon sun. No shadows, no mist, no secrets waiting in the corners, or at least, none that belonged to this case. Inspector Slack put on his hat. "I suppose this is goodbye, for now." "You know, Miss Marple, I used to think you enjoyed murder mysteries." Miss Marple laughed softly. "My dear Inspector, I don't enjoy murder." "What then?" "I enjoy understanding people." "That sounds almost worse." She smiled. "People are much more complicated." Slack laughed. Then he walked down the drive. Miss Marple watched him disappear beyond the gate. She returned home before sunset. Her cottage felt warm and familiar. She placed the photograph of Captain Gibbons on the mantelpiece temporarily, where the evening light touched the young man's face. Then she sat beside the fire. Her knitting needles began moving again. Outside, St. Mary Mead settled into another quiet evening. The church bell sounded. A dog barked in the distance. Someone laughed along the lane. Life continued. That was the strange thing about murder. For one person, the world ended. For everyone else, breakfast still had to be prepared. Letters still had to be posted. Gardens still needed tending. And clocks still had to keep ticking. Miss Marple looked toward the old clock on her mantel. Tick, tick, tick. Time had moved forward. The mystery was over. The lies had burned away. Captain Gibbons's name would finally be cleared. Mrs. Gibbons would face justice. And Blackthorn Manor would eventually become just another house in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple picked up her tea. A tiny smile appeared on her face. There was always another mystery somewhere. Not because people were wicked, but because people were human. And wherever human beings gathered, secrets followed. She returned to her knitting. The last ember in the fireplace glowed softly before fading into ash. Miss Marple watched it disappear. Then she whispered, "Truth always survives the fire." And outside, beneath the quiet stars, St. Mary Mead slept.